Well, I'd like to welcome Jon Meacham to our microphones here at the Jefferson Hotel. Our friend Connie Milstein put this hotel together just for this kind of conversation with someone who has done so much. Where to begin? Longtime editor of Newsweek, right?
True.
Started at Washington Monthly, right in this town,
True.
Correct?
Right in this, $10,000 a year.
Exactly. American Lion, your first Pulitzer Prize. You will no doubt get one for this book.
We'll move on quickly.
Okay, great. Exactly. Regular on Morning Joe.
Yes, ma'am.
Resident of Tennessee.
Very much so. No taxes.
So, no taxes.
Read my lips.
And now, you release this incredible book, Destiny and Power, and you're already on the bestseller list, and it's been like 3 days. So, welcome, Jon Meacham, everyone.
Think what Jesus did in 3 days.
True enough.
True enough.
It always comes back to Jesus with you, Jon.
It always does.
It really does.
Yeah. Or Jack Daniels.
And I'm delighted to have Megan Murphy from Bloomberg here with me. And this is how we have to begin.
Okay.
Because you've worked on this book for 17 years.
Yes.
And did you ever think that the moment it comes out would be when his son, Jeb, is not just running for president, but having the exact same struggles that he had when he was running for president?
There were moments when I thought it would come out when George P. was running for president and would be having the same struggles. And I think everyone in the room who has some journalistic connection should join me in a pact that when Chelsea and George P. run against each other, let's all quit. Let's just figure that Lancaster and York can take care of it themselves. That's a English dinner. No, I didn't. I met President Bush 17 years ago. I found him to be a much more complicated and interesting figure than I had expected. I'd been an undergraduate during most of his presidency, and so things were a little fuzzy at Sewanee because of Jack Daniels and other things. And so I just met him with Michael Beschloss at Walker's Point and was immediately struck by his quiet and persistent charisma. And if you're trying to, if you do what I do, which is write biographies of politicians, you're always trying to figure out how did they do it? How did they manage to execute the fundamental transaction, which is convincing us to entrust them, their hands, with ultimate authority. And as we all know, George Herbert Walker Bush is a great man. Massive public speaking was never a strong suit. He arguably gave two great speeches in his life. One is lost to history, but it turned around the Maine caucus of all things in 1980, which had been rigged by Howard Baker, by Bill Cohen for Howard Baker. And Bush came in and gave a great speech, and it helped set him up for Iowa, without which, if he had not won Iowa in 1980, he would have remained, as he put it, an asterisk. He never forgave Evans and Novak, or maybe it was Jack Germond, who wrote that Bush peaked the day he announced, which he still remembers. So my sense was that the quiet, persistent charisma had been why he became president. He had no natural political base. He never won a statewide race. He'd won 2 House races from Houston and Iowa, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Michigan, and Pennsylvania primaries before he won the nomination for president. And so what was that? And it became pretty clear to me pretty early on that it was because he just had this ineffable sense of command, that you could trust him. And so as the years went by, and I realized there was a White House diary, I wasn't sure how extensive it was. Every president sort of has a diary, but this was a genuine audio recording once or twice, sometimes 3 times a week. Interestingly, during crises, he tended to dictate more.
Why?
I think because he could only talk to himself. He could only confide fears or frustrations to himself, because part of his code was that nobody wants to hear the President of the United States complain. As he put it in his inimitable way, nobody wants to hear, "Oh, woe is me. You're just damn lucky to be there." And so I think it played a therapeutic role, actually. And they asked, so they offered to let me read it, and I knew within 2 or 3 pages, I think after the first dig at Nancy Reagan, that we were going to be fine.
So tell me, having read, what was the most surprising thing? What stands out to you the most out of such a volume of material? What stands out as, wow, that is a surprise to me, knowing what I know?
How deeply emotional and sensate he actually was. Bill Clinton said he felt our pain. George Bush really did. And I just think part of his code was you don't show it. I think he's shaped by 2 forces that came from his mother. One is a determined, steely will to win. This is a woman who once broke her wrist in the middle of a tennis match and kept playing and won. And she expected all the Bush children to go out on the house at Grove Lane in Greenwich and climb the trees. The taller, the better. Someone once said, "Mrs. Bush, aren't you worried they're going to fall?" And she said, "No, if they do, they'll learn something." So you had this competitive sense. And then there was a fatwa in the Bush household on the first person pronoun. So you were taught to win, to compete, always within the rules and always fairly, of course, but to win, but not to talk about it. So he would come in and say, "I hit a double," and she would say, "How did the team do, dear? Nobody likes the great I am. Don't be a braggadocio, George." And he can reel even if he were sitting here right now, he could, with some efficiency, list all these aphorisms that came from her about modesty. So politics was a strange career choice when you think about it, for a man who was trained not to talk about himself. I'm convinced that one of the reasons he was occasionally challenged by the English language was because he was hearing these 2 competing voices in his head. Win, win, win. Don't talk about yourself, don't talk about yourself, don't talk about yourself. And so he would just, I think, get lost sometimes in that. But the emotion also, I put this scene in the prologue because it struck me so, which was in his vice presidential diary in 86 or 87, in what had to be one of the worst pieces of White House advance ever. He was shown into a children's leukemia ward in Krakow. And of course, they'd lost their daughter Robin to leukemia in 1953. And he realizes where he is. And he starts to cry. But the press is all behind him. The pool is behind him. And he won't turn around until he's gotten himself under control. Because if he turns around, the story becomes about him, not about them. And so he has this scene where he's telling him, again, he's dictating this after the fact. He was standing over this little boy who was a leukemia patient, and he says, this poor kid thinks this crazy old man's crying over him, but I just hope he knows that I love him. I mean, that's just shot through, and I just didn't expect that.
Were you surprised that he gave you his diaries and didn't give it to his son? Because George W. Bush wrote a book about him last year.
He did. Surprised.
Was President George W. Bush surprised that you got the diaries and he didn't? Is that better said? Do you guys like that question?
I learned a long time ago not to assume anything about President George W. Bush. I don't know. I think that I don't know firsthand. Let me put it that way. I think that I suspect that the calculation may have been that that having that material coming from a neutral source would make it more credible and more powerful, if that had ever happened, perhaps. But the 43 book is incredibly valuable. I mean, and Decision Points, by the way, is a really good presidential memoir. It's the best-selling presidential memoir since U.S. Grant. Remember, we covered him.
Yeah, we were on MSNBC. That was the 8th hour.
Yeah, U.S. Grant on Hardball was one of the great moments. But I think that's why. And then Mrs. Bush, in an act of incredible generosity, gave me her diary from 1948 forward. And the only condition on the project was so he gave me the vice presidential diaries, the presidential diaries. Would talk to me as long as I wanted, usually patiently, always politely, but. It was actually difficult to interview him in Maine because he would want to get out on the boat or do something. Houston was a little easier, but even then, introspection was not a long suit. So it took a long time. Sometimes it was like the world's worst wasp-on-wasp therapy. I mean, he would cry, I would cry.
But there were no tears. No one knew, right?
No,
You could see him.
Yeah. Oh, but he cries all the time.
Why?
Because he's this deeply emotional man. I mean, Christopher Buckley has I mentioned before, has a great line that the thing about the 41st president is he has the tear ducts of a Sicilian grandmother. I mean, there'll be a heavy dew and he'll weep. But Mrs. Bush gave me the diaries, and so the only condition on this project was that any quotation from her diaries I had to blow by her. Not the context, not the interpretation, not the text. And so I went through and put together 90 pages worth of material that I wanted her approval on. We had lunch, she read them. It was totally fascinating because it was the first time she'd read them since she'd done her memoir 20 years ago now. And as she went along, she would say things like, I was an awfully opinionated 38-year-old. It's all I could do to say, well, ma'am, the apple didn't fall far from the chronological tree here. So it's just it was a remarkable opportunity. Again, if you do what I do, White House diaries like that, it just doesn't happen that much. And particularly their confidence that the historical record, that history would bear them out, is something that impressed me.
I want to talk a little bit about what you just said about being candid. And you knew with some of the material you had, whether it was about Cheney or Rumsfeld, that it was going to be controversial.
Yeah.
And have you been surprised by their response to some of the things in the book?
No, because I took it to them. I took everything that could be remotely controversial to everyone involved because I didn't want. To me, this was the historical record. It had to be as complete as possible on the front end. And so President Bush 43 saw everything. I described Vice President Cheney's reaction to it. Secretary Rumsfeld chose not to comment on the record. He did issue.
He commented on Twitter.
He did. Was that on Twitter?
Yeah.
Really? Huh. That's a light footprint. So I didn't want any controversy because the president made these remarks over several different sessions over several different years. So these were not drive-by comments. And starting in 08, so 08, 09, 10, 11, he was saying this. So it was important to me, and I thought important to him in a way, to make sure that it was bulletproof. And I did take all of those comments that got all the attention back to him last December and said, I can't let you revise and extend your remarks, but you could extend them. If you want to say, I said this in the heat of the moment, 6 years ago, whatever, I will note that parenthetically. And he looked at it, and then he looked me dead in the eye, and he said, that's what I said. And that was it. So he wanted this on the record. Including, and I've been struck by, I guess because iron ass is such a vivid phrase. I guess
a lot of iron ass.
There's a lot of iron ass. Yeah, no, there is. Liz Cheney said she was going to try to have T-shirts made up for the grandkids, which I thought was a good-spirited remark. But I've been struck that people have been so interested in the Cheney-Rumsfeld and less in the fact that he criticized 43's rhetoric, which to me struck me as the more historically significant thing, because it was the first time he ever broke his code to do that. And it was mainly the axis of evil, but which is also rich in irony, because there was a George Bush who talked about Saddam Hussein in terms of good versus evil, and there was a George Bush who was willing to go it alone against him, and that was George Herbert Walker Bush. I think the lesson there, ultimately, and the explanation, is the world looks very different from behind that desk than it does from any other perspective.
Did you have any sense, or is there any reporting on George W. Bush talking to his father at any point during the Iraq War?
Yep, on the front end, absolutely. He wrote him he told him that if the man won't comply, this is what you should do. It was Camp David 2002. Again, I don't know why the legend is so stubborn on this, but at Christmas 2002, George W. Bush briefed 41 told him what he was doing diplomatically, told them what they were doing, and 41 said, if the man won't comply with the inspections regime, the UN stuff, then you have to do what you have to do. And then he wrote him a letter. And let me tell you something. Former directors of Central Intelligence do not write letters they don't expect to be in the record. Doesn't happen. So when the operation began in March '03, he wrote his son a note saying, you've made one of the hardest decisions any president has to make. It was the right decision. You're facing a set of problems as large as any since Lincoln because of bloodshed on American soil. I'm a little puzzled. Well, I'm not puzzled because I think the reason the legend of the disagreements on the substance persists is because 41 became a useful tool with which to beat George W. Bush about the head. And so people who didn't have very much good to say about George H.W. Bush in real time, suddenly he became this combination of Adlai Stevenson and Cyrus Vance compared to his son. And so it was a way of critiquing the son by elevating the father, even though the father and the son weren't that far apart. Now, stylistically, they were, unquestionably, and that's ultimately what that criticism was about style more than substance.
Was he upset about the coverage of Maureen Dowd's famous column about the supermarket scanner? Did he feel that was
that was an
one
Andy
of the,
Rosenthal story?
Right, but then she wrote.
Did she?
She wrote about it too.
The supermarket scanner.
I don't want to argue with you about Maureen Dowd columns.
No, don't do that. No. No, the things that it's interesting. The things. I mean, the man has been in public life for half a century, 51 years. About 53 if you count. He was elected Harris County Republican chairman in 1962, so it's a half century now. He had also been the PR chairman for Eisenhower in Midland, which is like being the radar operator at Pearl Harbor, being a Republican in Texas in 1952. What?
You have 4 minutes. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
You're fine.
I'm sorry. That was when the Republican primary, literally, it was George Bush, Barbara Bush, and a drunk who wandered in and thought it was the Democratic primary. Did it? But what were we talking about? The supermarket. So in 50 years, the things that really stick in the president's craw are the supermarket scanner story, the Wimp factor, the Newsweek cover of October 1987.
And I believe you were the editor then, right?
No, I was in training somewhere.
I wrote it.
I was far away. But Evan Thomas will take all blame. Did it today even. Said, my fault. Supermarket scanner, Wimp factor, Ross Perot, and Donald Rumsfeld are basically the only things that really bother him unto this hour, which is pretty remarkable given that it's a half century.
A lot of the reporting also is focused on just his puzzlement, lack of understanding about the current political environment, and particularly the 2016 race. Do you think that's fair to say that he looks now and he says, I just can't understand how people would back someone like a Trump or a Ben Carson, and why aren't people gravitating to Jeb? I mean, or is he more just sees it as a completely separate time that things have gone to such an extent it becomes so polarized?
My sense is he's focused on his son as a son and not sort of the state of the Republican Party, honestly. I haven't had a direct conversation with him about 2016. Our last communication for the book was on September 8th, when Random House was sending armed guards to Tennessee to rip the manuscript out of my hands. And it was, in fact, the communication was a functional endorsement of same-sex marriage, because he'd had a diary entry from '88 where he said the country wasn't ready to codify homosexual marriages when he was talking about how he was going to take on Dukakis, which, interestingly, he knew intuitively what the 1988 campaign was going to be like long before Atwater or anyone came to him with a strategy. The first time Michael Dukakis' name appears in the diary, he says, this will not be hard to put into a liberal versus conservative framework. So there were, and he was also knew right after the Gulf War that the economy was going to be central to the election, not foreign policy, very early in '91. So he was intuitively political in ways that we don't really give him credit for. But he had this line out there about same-sex marriage, and so I called and said, have you changed your mind? And he agreed to send me a note, and it said, I still believe in traditional marriage, but people have a right to be happy without discrimination. I guess you could say I've mellowed. So that was when we closed up. But on 16, I think he just very much wants Jeb to do well, and I think that's where the focus is. The Trump factor raises uncomfortable psychological memories, right? I mean, a populist billionaire sort of complicating a Bush's path to the White House is a movie he's seen before. The Ross Perot story.
We have a few more minutes. Are there any questions from the audience? Hillary?
Jon, talk about Perot, Clinton, Bush.
Perot, Clinton, Bush.
Perot, Clinton, Bush.
I can't wait to read the book. But is he focused on Perot as the reason he lost, and as a Texan, did that particularly bug him? And
yes,
it was a complicated relationship with those two.
It
right?
was very complicated. In fact, it goes back to they shared a car at the 1969 Nixon inaugural. They drove around together. I don't know why I know that.
I was just going to
I don't know why that sticks in my. I need to get out more. But they did. And Perot offered Bush a job in 1977 when he left the agency to run his oil business. And Bush said no, and told me that Perot said, well, you don't say no to Ross Perot. And so was that the wing of a butterfly that led to they had tension over the POW MIA issue. Bush volunteered to go sort of tell Perot he had to cool it, and that was not well received. You don't say anything to Ross Perot, apparently. My reading of the political science on this is that the president's wrong. Bill Clinton was going to win that election, given all the different factors. It was a perfect storm. I mean, President Bush was suffering from Graves' disease, the thyroid condition that was affecting his energy and his acuity. The economy, the recovery was slower was not felt as fast as the Republicans needed it to. He was also living on borrowed historical time. It was an anomalous victory in 1988. We had not had one-party 12-year rule since Roosevelt and Truman. So the fact that he beat what he used to call the Van Buren factor, who was the last sitting vice president to succeed a president. The Van Buren hardball, by the way, was really good. I remember that.
Epic.
It was really good. And when Larry King doing the call-ins with Van Buren. So I think that, and also you had...
But he never really gave Bill Clinton credit for the political talent, and I always thought that was because he didn't want to acknowledge a failing.
You're exactly right. Until there were two moments where he did come to realize that Bill Clinton was one of the great talents of our time. One was when he went back in June of '93 to make the case for NAFTA, which had been negotiated on his watch, and Bush was speaking after Clinton, and Clinton gave one of his brilliant Clintonian performances in the East Room. And Bush got up and said, I just realized why he's living here and I'm not. The other story is from the tsunami relief trip. And this is basically President Clinton and Bush 41 were going to the Indonesian embassy to sign the Book of Remembrance. Bush 43 was in a motorcade behind them. 41 and Clinton walk into the Indonesian embassy. There's a painting on the wall. Clinton says, I love that painting. Who painted that? And the ambassador said, oh, that was Umbunga. This is Bush telling the story. One of our great artists. And Clinton said, that's great. And they go up, and they sign the book, and they come down, and 43 is coming in, and Clinton says, George, this is my favorite Umbunga. I love his work. This is a landscape by Umbunga. And 41 says, and I'm saying, no wonder that guy kicked my ass. So.
That's good.
That's funny.
Great. That's great.
Go ahead. Yes, Anita McBride.
Thank you, Tammy. John, one of the most interesting things that I've learned in your book that I didn't know about George H.W. Bush, and all of us have always talked about he had a resume tailor-made to be president of the United States. But actually, one of the things you revealed was a conversation he had privately with Richard Nixon in the Oval Office when Nixon wanted to give him a very different job.
Right.
Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Sure. Roads not taken are important in Bush's life. Roads taken and not taken. If he'd gone to Wall Street instead of Texas, he wouldn't have been president. I mean, he would have been a New England Republican, and we know how well that turned out. He'd be Link Chafee right now. You got to love a Washington crowd where Link Chafee is a punchline. You know? Got to love the Capitol. Y'all maybe should got more too. But he's lost the 70 Senate race to Benson. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. It was supposed to be Bush was going to beat Ralph Yarborough, the old aging populist, in the way Bill Brock beat Al Gore Sr. that year. That was supposed to be what happened. John Connally put Benson in the primary against Yarborough, and so Benson actually ran to Bush's right in that race. So different jobs have been suggested. Small business administration, all sorts of things. But the UN was the one that got Bush's attention. But Nixon had decided that he was going to bring Bush into the White House to work for Bob Haldeman, which a story that did not end well, since it ended in prison. But Bush makes the case that he wants to go to the UN. And it was this goes back to his intuitive, for a man who could be politically tone deaf, he actually had his moments. He knew an argument that would work with Nixon was that no one is up in New York defending you in the media financial circles, and I can do that. And so the grocer's son from Yorba Linda liked the idea that the son of the Connecticut senator from Yale and Andover was going to be defending him. So he calls Bush back in, and Bush had been a White House assistant for about 40 minutes. And I just think that if Bush had been around to be on the tapes, we just don't know. In Watergate, it was bad enough to be chairman of the Republican Party during Watergate. The fact that he survived that is striking.
But Nixon wouldn't let him live in the apartment.
Well, that's news. There's news. He wanted him to go live in Greenwich, establish residency, and run against Ribicoff again. That was in Barbara's diary. No one had ever known that. And in fact, Mrs. Bush said, I'd forgotten that.
Ruth. Hold on, let's get you the microphone. Ruth Marcus, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi. It strikes me that the message of your book, to the extent that it has a message, it may be different than the news of your book. The news of your book was about the 41, 43 et al. But the message, it strikes me, and I'm just partway through, is about the possibility and history of a different kind of politics and a different kind of Washington not so long ago than the one that we have now. And maybe that's kind of being a little rosy scenario history of it. But could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely the message of the book. And it was just a quarter century ago, and it actually happened. So it's not, as Bush would say, Ms. Rose scenario. But unquestionably, he is the last Eisenhower Republican. And many of his lieutenants don't like that because they want him to be more conservative. But in point of fact, his record taken as a whole, he was a moderate Republican. Americans with Disabilities Act, every building in America bears the mark of that piece of legislation. The Clean Air Act is still functionally our environmental policy. The 1990 budget deal, Bill Clinton will tell you at some length, that's redundant, I realize, that was a critical piece of legislation for what he wanted to do. As Clinton told me when I talked to him for the book that Bush 41 was the only Republican around who realized that if you consistently did something that defied arithmetic, it wasn't going to work forever. And so those three things alone are a significant domestic legacy. But he did it because, I think, because the Washington he had known as a congressman was a place where you were friends with other people. And, and I know people can say this is all gauzy and nostalgic, and yes, Fort Sumter was bad, and all of that. But in point of fact, George H.W. Bush, as a congressman from the 7th District of Texas, voted with Lyndon Johnson 53% of the time. When Nixon came in, that soared to 55%. So you had this sort of moderate figure. And the story that really crystallized what the transition you're talking about, because this really did take place on his watch. I mean, interestingly, he was a creature of one Washington who inadvertently presided over the creation of another. So three things happened while he was president. The rise of freelance partisanship, which is Gingrich on C-SPAN late at night making his pitch. The rise of the 24-hour cycle. We didn't have the digital world, but people like Tammy were taking over. I mean, Ross Perot would not have been possible without Larry King, without CNN, and all the talk shows. The Diary is, and I'm going to publish them ultimately. They have to be posthumous. But, I mean, he knew what Eleanor was saying on television. He knew, he was reading the White House news summary. It just drove him bananas, to use a technical historical term. So the rise of opinions being coming so rapidly was happening right there. Limbaugh bridges those two things. He's on the rise, to the point where in 1992 Limbaugh endorsed Buchanan, and so Bush invited Limbaugh to the White House, carried his bag upstairs to the bedroom. By the end of the campaign, Limbaugh was introducing George H.W. Bush at campaign rallies. And then the rise of confessional politics, at which Clinton was so good. That was just that generational difference was significant. So, it maybe it's nostalgic, but it can't only be nostalgic because his domestic record and how those bills passed was in large measure because he did apply personal diplomacy, not only abroad, but at least in the first 2.5 years at home. And the ADA passed. They broke a critical logjam because he'd invited Tom Harkin down. Harkin told me this story in Dickensian detail because it was so important to him that they were stymied in the negotiations over it. Bush had called Harkin, who was also a carrier-based pilot during World War II. Barbara was out of town, so they were having a stag cocktail hour on Friday afternoon. And it was Boyden Gray and Jack Kemp and Tom Harkin. It sounds like a bad skit. But Harkin said, "I don't want to ruin the moment, Mr. President, but I'm having a hard time with Sununu," which is, again, not unusual. And Bush turned to Boyden and said, "Take care of this." And things began to move. Now, I'm not saying that, a bottle of Bombay gin passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, but at that critical moment, you had a president who was actually engaging in the Capitol culture in a way that did ultimately produce a result. So I think that is important.
One more quick one.
So, John, you talked about his psyche about don't speak about yourself, but always win. Talk about your views about how he views himself as vice president.
Oh.
And people talk about who's the most influential, consequential vice president, and we hear it now all the time.
Right. Yeah, every vice presidential staff has to say that their vice president is the most consequential. I think he was consequential. Was he the most? Was he as important as Gore or as Biden? Probably not. I don't really know. I will say this, that the relationship with Reagan characteristically was very important to him. And remember, he didn't want him. So much so that I don't think the call came until 11:37 p.m. on the penultimate night of the convention, on Wednesday night. It was nearly midnight. The deal with Ford had fallen apart. And, Reagan asked, "Can you support the platform in all its particulars?" which Bush took to mean abortion. the pro-life parts? And he said, yes, I can. And then the next day, actually, Barbara Bush did the wisest thing. After they'd had coffee with Mrs. Reagan, they said, Mrs. Bush walked up to Governor Reagan and said, Governor, you're not going to regret this. We're going to work our tails off for you. And Mike Deaver said, in you telling that story later, said that was the smartest thing anyone could have said right then. And so Bush, made it his business to create an affectionate bond with Reagan. And whenever George Bush wanted to create an affectionate bond with somebody, that happened. I think he was important on foreign policy. I think he was wrong on Iran-Contra. He and Reagan supported a policy that Weinberger and Schultz did not support, and Weinberger and Schultz were right. So it was not totally smooth sailing. But I do think one of the mysteries of George Bush is how you could spend 8 years watching Ronald Reagan's use of the bully pulpit and seemingly take so little away from that. My ultimate biographical conclusion is that he was just intimidated by Reagan's pure skill. And Stu Spencer told me a story about Bush just watching in wonder sometimes at watching Reagan do something in one take.
So does he look at Vice President Cheney compared to his service?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Oh my God. You couldn't find two more different views. Absolutely. I think that Bush had a sense that Bush's view of the vice presidency, which was based on a couple of conversations, one with Mondale, one with Nelson Rockefeller, was that he should be a senior confidential advisor without portfolio, and that Reagan could absolutely trust him and he would never leak. And it worked. That worked for them. Was his unease with the way Cheney was vice president, did it have a connection to how he viewed the vice presidency? Absolutely.
Well, John, thank you so much for
Thank
this
you, ma'am.
incredible book. Thank you for this evening.
Well done.
Megan, thank you. America's Poet Historian. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you all for coming.